The purpose of this video is to give you some background about literary criticism. Literary criticism is something that you have been doing in literature classes throughout high school, at least, but it has its basis in some very technical and very specific schools of literary theory that we are going to talk about today. So what exactly is literary criticism? Quite basically, it is the study, analysis, and evaluation of a work of literature, just like what we do in English classes. And each school of criticism that we are about to look at uses a different lens or a different angle to view literature. And since we are about to do research, I made sure to cite my sources. If you are interested in a more detailed analysis, you can go to this website from Purdue OWL. So why? Why delve this deeply into literature? As you already know, it can reveal deep or hidden meaning in a work, like when we talk about symbolism, or we look into character motivation, or we analyze flashbacks and foreshadowing. It can reveal deeper meaning in a work. It can also identify the cultural values or beliefs in a novel or play. This is getting toward theme. We can identify what what message the author has about culture or society or the beliefs or humanity. And then we can connect those themes to other works of literature, either in the time period that the work was written or in present day or even farther back. And so this is kind of the basis of the whole study of literature in schools, especially honors, AP, advanced honors classes that you've been taking. Where did this all begin? Well, it began in ancient Greece. Plato was the first literary theorist, and he believed that in order for literature to be worthwhile, it must have a moral or virtuous lesson. It must teach you how to be a better person. And this was really the view that held greater sway up until Shakespeare's day, really. You learned back when we were reading Hamlet that the theater was not really considered a moral place to go. It was kind of looked down upon because what was being presented there didn't teach a moral lesson. Moral was very connected to religion at that time. But Plato's student, Aristotle, had a different idea of what made a work of literature good. And he said that effective or worthwhile literature or drama comes from it having a well put together plot, the proper balance of conflict and resolution. It has deep, rich character development. And post-Shakespeare, or based from Shakespeare, this is kind of where we've gone. And so modern literary criticism is based more on the Aristotelian point of view than the Platonic, but you do still see shades of this in the way people will analyze literature and plays. So these were the first, and the basis of all the rest that we're going to be looking at. Two other really basic ways of looking at literature are the Structuralist and the Deconstructionalist. So the Structuralist point of view finds that the work itself is the most important thing. So looking at the words on the page and the way they are put together and ignoring anything else outside of that. So it doesn't matter what happened in the author's life or what was going on when they wrote the book. It doesn't matter how readers respond. Everything you need to know is in the book itself. And this might sound familiar because this is similar to like taking a very literalist view of the Constitution, saying everything we need to know about law is right there in that document. Or also there are biblical studies that are like this too. So this really just focuses on the book itself and the words within it, knowing that readers are going to change, but the text does not. The text remains the same, so we have to focus on the text. As you might guess, deconstructionalist theory goes the opposite direction. Deconstructionalist theory says that the reader's interaction with the text is very important, and that without the reader responding to and interacting with the text, the book is nothing. It's just words on a page. It gets its meaning from the reader's response. because every reader can have a different response based on what they've brought to the table, and that all of those responses are valid. A reader's interpretation might even change over time, and each of those interpretations is valid. Now, this doesn't mean that there are no wrong answers. It just means that there's more than one right answer. The interpretations still have to be validated and arguable through the text. So, for example, we can read Hamlet and argue whether we see his perspective or Ophelia's perspective. We can argue whether we see Hamlet as courageous or cowardly based on the way he behaves in the text. And we can argue both of those with examples from the text, so both are valid. But you cannot read Hamlet and say it is a beautiful romance where everyone lives happily ever after. That's just wrong. There are wrong answers, but there are also multiple right answers. And that's what this reader response theory is saying. So those are the two kind of basic schools of thought. New historicism is also a really important one. And when that used to be, so it was like you were either a structuralist or a deconstructionist. And then new historicism came around and said, you're not looking at enough information. Look at all the context you're missing if you're just basing it on the text or the reader response. New historicism kind of took over the 20th century. It became the focus of a lot of the articles that you're going to be reading. They're going to come kind of from a new historicism perspective, even if they've got the lenses we're about to look at. And new historicism said you've got to look at the context, the cultural and historical elements that were going on when this work was written. And so they're going to ask, how does this work reflect the culture of the time in which it was written? So they're going to look at the book 1984, and they're going to say George Orwell wrote this right after World War II. So he is basing this off of the rise of totalitarianism, and that is crucial to understanding the point in his novel, which it is. They're going to say, what is the author's take on that event or the time period? Even if it's not directly addressed in the book, because of the context and in which the book was written, the author's making a statement about that time period somehow. That's what a new historicist perspective says. So, for example, when we read Lord of the Flies, we said, well, this was written directly after World War II. So even though the war is not a primary event in the book is still about the war. And that's what a new historicist would say. How does the work portray or criticize the political leaders of the time? And so this could be very direct. There could be, like in 1984, political leaders as characters in the book, or people talking about the politics of the book, but it could also be very subtle. And so in Lord of the Flies, we talked a little bit, we didn't really use the word politics very often, but we talked about leadership through Ralph and Jack. And so then new historicists would come in and say, and try to be really specific about what style of leadership they're following and what William Golding is saying about world leaders during his time period through those characters. And finally, new historicism will also ask, how does the work address marginalized peoples? And so looking at the time period in which it was written, who was being oppressed in that time period? If this was written during the time of slavery, let's look at how African Americans are being presented. If this was written during the early 20th century when women were fighting for suffrage, let's find out how women are being presented. And you'll see in these lenses that we are about to talk about how some of them look directly for different marginalized or subculture populations. But first, post-colonial criticism. This is also kind of an offshoot of new historicism, but looking with the very specific lens of post-colonialism. After the colonial era ended, kind of post-World War I, the novelists began to respond to that in their writing, and therefore critics began to respond to it in their criticism. They began to notice it in the literature. And so you have to look at it from both sides of the issue, colonialism and its aftermath. What happened to the people when colonization was taking place, and now what's happening to the people now that it has ended and those colonial leaders have pulled out. So they will ask questions like, how does the text represent colonial issues? Is it directly taking place in a colonized area, or is it representing how colonialism affected the colonizing country? What does the text reveal about cultural differences between the people? How does it depict the colonizers? How does it depict the indigenous populations that were colonized? Is one reflected in a more positive light? Basically asking, whose side is it on? Is what problems of the post-colonial era are addressed, and are there solutions being proposed? What is this shining a light on? Is it championing the colonizers or the colonized, the indigenous peoples? Is it reinforcing the Western cultural beliefs of the colonizers, or is it criticizing them? Is it undermining them and instead championing the indigenous cultures? A lot of the books that y'all are reading are going to deal with colonialism in some way. All right, psychoanalytic criticism. This is all based on the psychological theories of Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud changed the world with his publications, basically, because he looked at what was going on in the human mind and kind of gave a language to the way to talk about it. And so in order to understand psychoanalytic criticism, you have to understand Sigmund Freud and his main theories. So I'm going to break it down really basically here and pay attention for these things, because in addition to the critics being aware of psychoanalytic theory, the novelists were aware of it as well. And these psychological theories of Freud gave them a real playground in which to place their characters and see how their characters responded to life and brought these psychological, this trauma or the relationships or the fears to life and how it affected their lives. And so anyway, here's some background about his theories. Freud was interested in the unconscious desires and fears in mankind's head. He looked at defense mechanisms that people develop to cover up their unconscious desires and fears, or to deal with past trauma in things like repressed memory or denial, regression into these childhood fears or fear of intimacy, and where those came from. He felt like he explained that a lot of people's current psychological situations came from childhood events. He is also the one who gave us the language of the id, the ego, and the superego. So if you have heard people talk about those, Freud is where they came from. And the Oedipus complex is one of the ways he dealt with relationships between a child and their mother, for this one in particular. And so the whole idea is that a child's relationship with their mother leads to competition between the child and the father. So the love that a child has for their mother makes them see their father as competition because their father and mother love each other. That's kind of the whole idea. But I want to give you a little bit more about it because it's kind of interesting. So please pardon me this quick interruption with the story of Oedipus. I've written it down so it's less confusing. So they used to teach Antigone to sophomores. I don't think they do anymore. Sophocles wrote a trilogy of plays, Oedipus Rex, Antigone, or Oedipus and Colonus and Antigone. And so Oedipus is the first in that series. Whole idea is when Oedipus is a baby, his parents take him to an oracle who can predict the future. And the oracle predicts that Oedipus will grow up to kill his father and marry his mother. His parents are horrified. They don't want that to happen. And so they decide to just leave this baby in the woods and let him die and have another one. Sounds horrible, but something people used to do back then, I guess. Luckily for Oedipus, another couple finds him in the woods and raises him. And so he knows nothing about the prophecy. The people who raise him know nothing about it. Oedipus doesn't know the people who raised him aren't his real parents. He grows up several cities away. But then as an adult, he is traveling to the city of Thebes, where he was born. And on the way there, he quarrels with a man on the road and kills him. He feels guilty about this. And so he goes into the city of Thebes, finds the man's wife to apologize. But he ends up falling in love with her. Her name is Jocasta. He ends up falling in love with her and marrying her. They have kids. The kids are growing up, all that good stuff. But then he finds out, and I won't go into the whole story. This is what this play is about, so this takes a while. He finds out at the end that the man that he killed was his father, and the woman that he married is his mother. He's horrified. He blinds himself. His wife kills herself. It's a big, traumatic deal. But anyway, so that's just the backstory about Oedipus. The whole idea with the Oedipal complex is that Freud believed every little boy goes through an Oedipal phase where he loves his mother the most. She's the most important woman in his life. This is not a sexual thing. And so that leads to a subconscious, unconscious competition with their father when children are very little. But normal, healthy boys grow out of it. This is a normal, natural phase, but boys grow out of it as they get older and they start to develop then a relationship with their father. If something goes wrong there, or if something goes wrong at some other point, it can become, if something unhealthy happens between mother and father's love when you're a child, then it might cause you to then have an unhealthy, you'll basically get stuck in that phase. And he calls that the Oedipus complex, when the boy does not outgrow it and develops an unhealthy obsession with their mother. If you're already thinking Hamlet, you're on the right track because Hamlet does kind of have some Oedipal issues. The version for father-daughter relationships is called the Electra complex. And I'm not going to go into that whole story because I don't know it as well. But basically the whole idea is that something that is healthy when you're small gets skewed, some damage, some trauma occurs, and it becomes an unhealthy relationship. So how does this apply to literature? Why did I just go through all that? So psychoanalytic critics look for the following. They say, does this character have repression, repressed emotions, repressed memories, or do they have fears that stem from childhood events? What are the family dynamics like in this book? Is there a power struggle between children and parents? How is the male main character's relationship with females? Is that because of an Oedipal complex thing? How are the female characters' relationships with men? Is that because of an issue with her father? These critics might also look at the psychological state of the author. And so those of you that are reading Hemingway, this is something that comes up with Hemingway sometimes. His relationship with his mother may have affected the way he writes female characters. And then this is really kind of a stretch, in my opinion, but you can also look at the psychological effects and motives of the reader. And the way I see this being the most relevant is kind of related to the trigger warnings that we talk about now. Like before a film or a book, you might tell someone that, there are trigger warnings in this. Be aware that if you have past trauma or if you have sensitivity to these issues, then you're going to react a certain way to this book. That's the way that this makes the most sense to me. All right, Marxist criticism. I promise I'm not going to go down a long rabbit hole like that again. Marxist criticism, whole idea, class struggle, and economics. This is based on the theories of Karl Marx. Karl Marx was a German philosopher and economist. Karl Marx was very concerned about the oppression of the working class and how the elite or wealthy class benefits by oppressing the working class. He talked a lot about the evils of capitalism, which, by the way, is our current economic system in the United States, and the virtues of socialism. Socialism meaning common ownership of goods and even distribution of wealth. This is something that you guys are probably a little more familiar with than students of the past because of Bernie Sanders, for example, who talks about it a lot. So how does this apply to literature? Critics might want to know, what social class is being represented in a positive light? Does this book champion or praise the actions and values of the wealthy? Or does it praise the values of the poor and cast the values and virtues of, or lack of virtue in the upper class? What economic values are reinforced? Does this book reinforce capitalism? Does it reinforce socialism? Does it present those issues in a positive or negative light? If there's a capitalist system in the book, is it showing that capitalist system to be working or failing? How do the characters from different classes interact? I probably should have started with this one because it's kind of the heart of the matter. So if in the book there are characters from different social classes, are they in conflict with each other, or are they working together to solve problems? Is there a group of characters that are represented more positively and another group more negatively? What social class are they from? That's the whole idea. Another question that might get asked is, what social class will benefit if this novel is well received? And that's something that a critic might ask early in the publication of a book. You're not going to ask that question about a book that was published 100 years ago, but you might ask, why are we continuing to teach this book if it supports these values and we are no longer interested in those values? That's kind of how you would rephrase that question for an older book. But this is kind of asking, what impact will this book have on society? You guys might have studied the book The Jungle in history class. And so it had quite an impact on society because of the way the meatpacking industry was presented and the way the immigrant working class was presented in that novel. That's the kind of thing that this question is asking. All right, so these last two, yes, we are finally to the last two. These last two groups of criticism look at marginalized populations, meaning that any group of people that are not upper class white men, basically. And you can use any of those groups to go in here and look at them as a critical lens. So whether that's feminist or African American, which are the two we're going to look at, it could be Hispanic, it could be Latin American, it could be LGBT, and it could be Christian, it could be Muslim, it could look at any group of society and view the work through that lens. So you can kind of apply these across those lines. So with feminist criticism, the main question is, how does the work represent women and their equality to men? Are male and female roles defined? And if so, is that presented as the way things should be, or is that definition being criticized? What are the power relationships between men and women? Within these female roles, are men given all the power? Are women presented as being subjected, or are they lesser citizens, basically? How does the work portray sisterhood and the power of women working together? So first I want to deal with these two because I used to misunderstand books in this way. I used to look at a book sometimes and say, well, in this book, all the women are in subservient positions and all the men are in power positions. So I don't like this book because it is anti-feminist. But you need to look a little bit closer than that because sometimes writers, quite often actually, writers are presenting a situation like that in order to criticize it. So they're showing women in subservient positions in order to point out what's wrong with that, in order to show how a society structured like that will fail. And so you kind of have to look a bit closer and say, okay, so this is what I see going on, but what is the writer doing with it? Are they showing it this way because they want to show what's wrong with it, or are they showing it this way because they want to show that that is the way it should be? So you kind of have to ask a second question. For this one, how does the work portray sisterhood and the power of women working together? Even if there are not any central male figures in a book, it could be a feminist book because it could be showing that women can work together to achieve everything in society that needs to be achieved. So look at the relationships between women. Are the women working together cooperatively? And are they achieving more together than they could alone? Or is the work showing that women cannot work together? Are the women portrayed as catty and competitive, and in that way more stereotypically showing how women will fail to cooperate? And finally, what does the work reveal about the economic and social effects of the patriarchy, kind of adding a Marxist element to that as well? African American criticism is similar, and again, you can kind of fill in other groups here. How does this work depict African American characters and culture? How are the politics of race portrayed? Are racial issues a central focus of this book politically and economically as well, down here at the bottom? Do the characters reflect Eurocentric or Afrocentric cultural traits? Are the values and virtues of white European people being shown to be higher or more virtuous, or is the work celebrating and championing the Afrocentric cultural traits above those Eurocentric ones? Pay attention to the authorship. Anytime you're looking at a minority group in a book, you have to go then look at the author and say, okay, is this work written by a person of color and therefore coming from an inside perspective? Or is this written by an outsider to this group, writing about it from an outsider perspective? So for example, if you're looking at a work that has a lot of Asian American characters and it was written by a white American, then you have to look at this attitude of white Americans toward that group. And you might also consider whether or not the author's perspective is valid if they are writing from outside of their culture group. How does the work empower African Americans or Asian Americans or LGBTQ? Is it showing this group in a positive light, in an optimistic light? Is their success and optimism, are the values being portrayed in a way that shows their virtues or not? And then economic and psychological, psychoanalytical brings in the other two groups to this as well. How is race portrayed as part of the economy? What are the economic implications of race in this work? And race and LGBT issues are central issues to several of these books. And it does affect the message and the theme of the work. And so this is an important lens for you to recognize as you're reading through your books. Now, I know that was a really long PowerPoint and video. Think about these things as you are reading your books that you choose for your critical project, because you might begin to kind of recognize them. If they're just kind of in the back of your mind, then you might kind of start to notice what's going on in your book in a new way by thinking about these critical lenses. And then you will also, as we start doing research in a week or so, you will also start to notice it in the articles that we are reading. I was going to go ahead and preview what we're going to be doing in the next lesson, but this has been pretty long. So just make sure you go back through to answer the questions. And I will also put a PDF of this on Kidim so that you can access that once you are done with the video.